Hi, Will. How you doing?
Very well. How are you today?
I'm pretty good.
Well, thanks for coming on Free Will. I am Will Wilkinson at the Cato Institute, and you are?
I am Paul Bloom in the Department of Psychology at Yale University.
Well, thanks again for coming on to chat with me, Paul. I think this is your second Bogging Heads appearance. You were on with Josh Knobe once before, is that right?
Yep, my friend Josh, and that was a lot of fun.
Yeah, well, hopefully we can cover slightly different ground. In particular, today I wanted to talk to you about two recent pieces that you had in popular publications. One being, the most recent being the piece in Slate that you had on basically why atheists are such lousy people, and then a piece that you had in The Atlantic on multiple personalities. So I thought maybe we could jump in first on the article. We'll have a link to it on the site. I think it was called "Does Religion Make You Nice?" and the subhead was "Does atheism make you mean?" So what was the inspiration for this piece, Paul?
Well, a book came out about countries like Denmark and Sweden and how people there behave, and I'm very interested in religion and atheism, so it was a fun article to write. I should take the opportunity to say two things. One thing is that I myself am an atheist, and the second thing is I'd like atheists to stop sending me angry emails, because in the end I conclude that religion doesn't make you nice and atheism doesn't make you mean. What I'm interested in the article is a tension between two sets of facts. One set of facts comes from the United States, and this is compiled mostly by Arthur Brooks in a couple of very interesting books, where he does have evidence saying that atheists are A, less happy than religious people, more likely to describe themselves as miserable, and B, that they are less nice, as defined in terms such as giving to charity or giving blood or giving to the homeless and so on. So he concludes, and a lot of people conclude, is that religion makes you nice, and that atheists are by and large rotten, unhappy people. And maybe religion makes you nice because of belief in supernatural beings and the like. So that's one set of facts. What I was interested in my Slate article is the tension between that and another set of facts having to do with countries like Sweden and Denmark, where people are, relative to the United States, are atheists. They don't have strong religious beliefs, and yet they're pretty nice. They're nice and they're happy. So it was interesting to me trying to reconcile them.
Yeah.
Pardon?
Yeah. So what's going on? How can these two things be true?
Yeah. What I think is going on is that it's not the God part. It's not religion per se that's making a difference. Rather, it's community. So in the United States, atheists are a despised minority. There are these polls out where they ask people, if somebody from your political party was nominated and you found him very qualified, would you vote for them? And if he was black, yes. Almost everybody says yes. What if it was a woman? Almost everybody says yes. Muslim, Jewish, the numbers drop. Gay, the numbers drop. It's still way above 50%. You want to get below 50%, you ask about atheists. Over half of Americans say they would not vote for an otherwise qualified atheist. And if you ask them why, it's because they say atheists are immoral. They're not spiritual. They're not good. You can't trust them. And atheists in America, then, are in a position of being not very well liked and not respected. And I think this has a corrosive effect. I think it makes you unhappy. And it makes you a little bit sour on things like charity and donating to others. You're excluded from this broader community of people who are involved in things, and you're isolated. So that's an atheist in America. An atheist in Sweden or Denmark is just part of everybody and not picked out, not hated. And I think as a result, those atheists live, the same productive, happy, generous lives as everyone else.
Well, that seems plausible to me. I'm in fact embittered, Paul, by the fact that my political prospects here in the United States are ruined by the record of secular, heathen writings that I've put on the internet.
You are very unlikely to be the next president.
Yeah, I am extremely unlikely to be I'm worse off than, like, as you say, like I'd be better off being a gay Muslim dude.
Yeah, I've always wondered, what if you add them up? Like, suppose you were a female gay Muslim.
Yeah.
Is that worse than an atheist?
I don't know.
Also, they never ask about pedophiles. And
yeah.
I just wonder, is that better or worse than atheists?
Yeah, I think it would be pretty bad. I think America is anti-pedophile by and large. But worse than atheists? Who
Hard
knows?
to say.
I know,
Hard
because what's going to keep an atheist from abusing children, Paul? Nobody's watching. They don't think so.
That's true. It's the atheist pedophile connection.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of obvious. If God is dead, everything is permitted, and when everything's permitted, the first thing you want to do is abuse children.
And that's what a lot of people will tell you. In fact, Laura Schlesinger, I quote her as she quotes Dostoevsky. Exactly. If God is dead, if there's no God, everything's permitted. What's stopping us from evil acts? And her claim is, without the idea of a supernatural being looking over you, you're going to be rotten. You're going to have sex with kids and with animals, and you're just going to be self-serving and terrible. And it's a very sour view of human nature that we need fear of supernatural retribution to keep us decent. And it's a false view of human nature. People have things called people have moral values. People have a sense of right and wrong. We have a conscience, and you don't. It's, I think, independent, separate from a belief in supernatural beings.
Yeah, a deeply theological, a divine command sort of theory of the good. And when you think that the reason that people are moral is because they're, bucking for the ultimate reward or trying to, avoid, burning for infinity and brimstone, like, that's the ultimate sort of homo economicus rational choice theory, right? That there is no motivation other than pure self-interest. So, and the only thing that could possibly restrain us from predation and from evil in general is a strong sense of just completely terrible external sanctions that we can't be trusted to be to restrain ourselves, that we have to fear that something horrible is going to happen to us if we don't, or that there's some amazing reward for us if we follow the rules, and that actually always has struck me as an incredibly bleak and reductive. People are always accusing me of being reductive, but I think that's sort of a reductive notion of motivation.
I think so too. I mean, I guess it's possible that there's some people on Earth who are like that, and they would kill and rape and steal, if not for fear that God would notice and punish them. But I don't think I've ever met such a person. I sure wouldn't want to. So it is a belief view. It might be that heaven and hell, the sort of a carrot of heaven and the stick of hell, do motivate certain behaviors you wouldn't otherwise do. Behaviors that sort of follow out, that don't follow naturally from a moral sense.
Yeah.
So religion might have strictures saying, if you don't do such and so, you're going to go to hell. And you might have otherwise done such and so. You didn't know it was wrong. And so religion might sort of enforce moral codes that are psychologically and socially unnatural through heaven and hell. But certainly, day-to-day good behavior, I think, has nothing to do with supernatural belief.
So let's back up a second, Paul. So you've done a lot of, and I think maybe you talked about some of this with Josh last time. You're identified with a body of research that basically says that people are, predisposed to believing in God, more or less. That people are at least predisposed to believe in supernatural things because we have sort of separate systems for thinking about sort of inanimate objects that follow the laws of physics, and a different system for thinking about intentional beings that have goals and desires, and it's natural for us to project that latter system in a way that just makes it seem plausible that we are not that our souls are separate from our bodies, that there could be disembodied intelligences out there watching us, and so forth. So you think that, correct me if I'm mutilating all of this stuff, but you think that religion is sort of natural in some sense, that it's a side effect, it's a predictable side effect of human nature.
No, you got exactly right. I'm speechless. I have nothing to add to that. I think, so I'll keep talking, of course. I do think religion comes natural. I think religion is a byproduct of certain cognitive systems that we've evolved to have for dealing with the material world and mostly dealing with the social world. So I think religion isn't an adaptation, but it's a biological accident, what Stephen Jay Gould called a spandrel. Mm-hmm. And what you talked about, which is my position, is that we're natural-born dualists. We think of bodies and souls as separate, and this makes possible all sorts of religious views, including the view that there could be beings without material bodies, like gods, and ghosts, and angels, and spirits. And it also makes possible the view that we can survive the deaths of our bodies. So it makes an afterlife cognitively possible to believe in. And so in that sense, religion is natural. Religion is also natural in certain other senses, in that there's some evidence that people are sort of common sense creationists. Mm-hmm. So young children's natural take on the world when they see complex design or structure is to assume that it has an intentional origin. And so the view that things that, say, biological creatures have evolved through natural selection, through a combination of selection and randomness, is I think scientifically correct, but also very unnatural for people, and people resist it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, one of the reasons I bring it up is because I think you had an article. I don't know how long ago it was. I think it was in the Atlantic that summarized your view, and you noted that even a fairly large percentage of scientists had some sort of theistic or supernatural beliefs, and that you had to go to the members of the National Academy of Science to find a group of scientists who were predominantly atheist. And so that suggested to me that, especially like if you're already in a very religious society like the United States, people who are going to identify themselves as atheists, there must be something weird about them. There must be something unusual about them. If we are sort of natural-born dualists who are very disposed to accepting the existence of supernatural powers, then the people who self-consciously reject that have to be a little bit unusual. And I'm wondering if the character traits that predict people's identification as an atheist, the character traits that predict that people are going to somehow find their way past their own natural religiosity, might also be things that would predict a lower level of happiness. I
think that's a good point. I would distinguish different senses of atheists. So in my developmental work, and the work talking about how religion is natural, I think everybody is prone to be a natural-born dualist and to believe in creationism. This comes very natural. And even a lot of people who self-describe as atheists still believe in an immaterial soul, for instance. And they may have other beliefs that they might not believe in a single omnipotent, omniscient God, but they might believe in ghosts or angels and so on. There's some polling data finding that people who self-identify as atheists have a lot of beliefs that you and I might still call religious. Mm-hmm. But let's just narrow it down to people who call themselves atheists in the sense that they don't believe in God. They don't think there's a God up there observing them and who created the universe. And you're right, they're going to be unusual in certain ways. They're going to be motivated to override their gut feelings. They have to be motivated to override the strong community consensus about this. Mm-hmm. And they have to be gutsy enough to confess their views, given that their views are so incredibly unpopular. And you're right. These are not necessarily the ingredients of a happy person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things that... I agree with you that most of it is likely to be the fact that you find yourself part of a stigmatized minority, and especially when it comes to the charitability of non-religious people. In the United States, there's my sense is that there's a very large proportion of charitable giving is mediated by religious institutions. Yeah. So if you don't participate in them, you're probably just going to give less to charity on average because people aren't asking you in the same way that they're asking you if you show up at church every week.
It's true. Religious institutions are a mechanism for charitable giving. And then there's the point, and P.Z. Myers says this. He's an atheist biologist blogger. And he says, this is a paraphrase, but he basically says, look, why the hell should I give my money and my stuff to people who think I'm a monster, who don't let me into their group? It is going to have that sort of effect.
Yeah. But then I also wonder. So one of the things that I've always, as an atheist, right? There's a certain kind of cultural politics that you have to deal with, right? Because then you end up with. There's a lot of people who are themselves non-religious who will profess to despise the sort of Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris village atheist types, right? Who think that despite the fact, even if they agree with them, the thought might be that they're not being sufficiently respectful of the religious. I find this to be some sort of a kind of political move where. And I agree with it on the one hand, that when you live in a pluralistic culture that's got a huge diversity of views, tolerance is one of our sort of primary social virtues. We have to get along. It's good to tolerate people, to not mock the things that people find important if we're going to be able to live together peacefully. But at the same time, if truth is important, if rationality is important, and if you think it's really the case that somebody's beliefs are simply ridiculous, given the standards of good reasoning and evidence and logic, then it also doesn't seem like you're treating people with a lot of respect by simply just shutting up. And I've always had a hard time like finding that sweet spot where you are at once respecting people in the sense that you acknowledge that what they believe is profoundly important to them, but in another sense respect them by taking them seriously as rational beings who ought to be able to provide reasons for their convictions. I feel like if you shift too far in either direction, you end up guilty of some kind of disrespect or other. And I don't know if you have a view about that. But
no, I agree. I'm also sort of personally torn. On the one hand, I actually just tend to agree with just about everything that people like Dawkins and Harris and Dennett say about religion, and I think you're right, which is it's a form of if you respect people, you tell them, you make arguments, and you expect them to be receptive to argument. You listen to their counter-arguments. And religion has a weird status. It's almost a sort of weird sort of affirmative action for religious beliefs, where if somebody tells you, if somebody tells you that they can't come to your house on Thursday night because they think there's monsters roaming the streets on Thursday, you think they're mad. If people tell you they can't come to your house on the Sabbath because they're religious, you think, I have a lot of respect for that. And if something, you take the wackiest view and you mark it as religious, and all of a sudden everything changes. You're supposed to respect it. You're supposed to take it seriously. And I could see that being grating. And so I'm with Dawkins and a bunch on that. On the other hand, like you also said, these are views that people hold dear, including people I love. And people, and just common decency and respect says you don't mock people for things that they hold dear. I've often wondered about the political efficacy of things, and some people say, look, the problem with Dawkins and a bunch is they're giving atheists a bad name. They're polarizing people against atheists. I actually think it has sort of the opposite effect, which is they're adopting a strong position, and as a result, making compromise possible. So they're like advocates, like gay advocates who say, let's have gay marriage, and everybody says that's terrible, that's so extreme, that's bizarre. Let's compromise on civil unions, and all of a sudden, a position nobody would have otherwise taken becomes on the table. And then gradually culture shifts towards the extremes. And so maybe, to have somebody like Dawkins around makes it easier for somebody to say, I'm agnostic.
Yeah.
Or maybe we shouldn't necessarily teach this chunk from the Old Testament in biology class. Like, maybe not. Maybe we'll just skip that. And people say, oh, I guess that's, it makes, it allows for a space for middle views. And so I think it actually serves a very, very valuable purpose to have people like Dawkins around, even if their style makes people uncomfortable.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree entirely with that. I mean, I'm one of those people who I think secularization is a good thing, that I think there are lots of positive consequences of secularization. And a lot of times I feel like the argument that if you are out there publicly advocating for atheism, that you're being disrespectful, it's a kind of cultural politics where people are trying to stifle the mechanisms by which secularization happens. And so you definitely have to resist. I think that atheists who think that secularization is salutary for the culture have to resist giving in to the argument that they're being disrespectful by simply making their argument in public that a lot of people's religious beliefs are unreasonable. And that one of the important things of standing up, but like in this points, I think, towards the point of your article, that atheists seem a little bit unfriendly or a little bit unhappy because they're socially isolated. What you want to do is signal, maybe to this, a college student who's wondering what to think, that you're an okay person if you decide to be an atheist. That some of us are out here who believe this, and we're respectable people. We're good people. And so by actually being out there and advocating it, you're creating the possibility of a growing community of unbelievers. And one of the things that I think keeps that keeps American rates of religiosity so high is the fear of the downside of nonconformity. So the more people there are out there making the argument, the less it seems like it'll hurt to agree with the argument.
I think that's right, and I also think I think one implication of what you're saying is that prominent people who are atheists, like entertainers and politicians, as scientists, whatever, should come out as atheists. And I'm using the phrase intentionally because there is an analogy here where when someone who is, a beloved actor comes out as gay, it's good for how the public at large receives gay people. Yeah,
it shifts the norms at the margin.
Exactly. So it's possible that 20 years from now, when my kids run for office, it would be acceptable for them to run for office as atheists. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure, but it's possible.
Well, yeah. Let's dream.
Let's dream. Let's pray.
Well, yeah. Let's pray that atheists one day may wield ultimate political power.
Yeah.
In the United States.
I'm sure there's a lot of people delighted at that thought.
Yeah, delighted at that. And especially because, and I mean, this is one of the aspects of the culture war argument in the United States. Is that the Republican Party throughout a lot of the 20th century, the best thing about the Republican Party, in my opinion, was that it was staunchly anti-communist. And I've always been staunchly anti-communist, and I think that's the side of the angels. But there's always this relationship between the communists who are atheists, right? And so there's this idea that there's this deep-seated relationship between liberty and the sort of the American system and religiosity, and so that's one of the most that's not one of the definitely not the most unfortunate thing about communism is that it was atheists and gave atheists a bad name, but that is one of the unfortunate things about communism is that in a lot of people's minds the godlessness of communism is what drove the totalitarian urge. And that if we become godless people, we will be unable to maintain our sort of liberties as free people. And I think that's one of, just as in terms of the culture war argument, that's what you have to persuade a lot of Americans of, is that our morality, the value of our liberty, the value of the ideals embodied in the American tradition don't depend on religious conviction, and that's an uphill fight. But I think it's something that is doable.
I think that's right, and I think unfortunately the way the Democrats have responded to that sort of concern is by enthusiastically embracing religion. There were different points in the election where Obama and McCain seem to be battling amongst themselves about which one is the most spiritual and religious. Mm-hmm. And actually, I think Obama probably won. I think his religious, he did a better job of conveying himself as a religious person, and maybe he had to, since he's a Democrat.
Yeah. Well, I think he's actually did. I think both of them are kind of, to tell you the truth, just my completely gut sense is that neither of them are actually very religious people. And I think it's actually just hard. John McCain's really not very good at faking stuff.
No.
I just don't think he's a very religious guy. Doesn't care that much about it, and he has a hard time projecting it. I think Barack Obama is exceedingly good at constructing personas that are appealing and politically expedient. And his persona as an African American, I think, is one of them, and that's one of the things that I love about his memoir, is that he so explicitly talks about how he's made these choices about what his identity is going to be, and they're all choices that just happen to be the choice you would make if you were going to be a successful politician in the United States.
Yeah. And one of those choices is going to church, talking a lot about Jesus Christ, talking about spiritual and moral values. Mm-hmm. And, you'd be very difficult to win without much of that.
Yeah. Speaking of personas, Paul, I'm gonna try to.
Oh, that's a good segue.
Try for the segue. Your piece in The Atlantic, first person plural, talks about sort of multiple selves, and one of the things that the article focuses on. I mean, you talk about multiple selves in a number of senses. So maybe we can talk about the difference between having multiple personas, having literally having multiple personalities, and then the problem of sort of personal continuity over time, what it means to, bind your future self to the, intentions of a present self. So tell me a little bit about what led you to write this article.
I've always been interested in what philosophers call self-binding. I've been very interested in the idea of doing something now to thwart your behavior in the future. Mm-hmm. If you smoke, you beg your friends not to give you cigarettes later on, even if later on you really want the cigarettes. If you're a dieter, you do all sorts of things to keep tempting food away from the house. There's now all these sort of technologies. There's a web page, stick.com, where you arrange to give away money if you fail to meet a goal. If I don't lose a pound a week, I have to give $100 to the George Bush Presidential Library. Mm-hmm. And at
terrible.
The time, I don't want to give. Pardon me?
That would be terrible.
That would be terrible. Mm-hmm. Or you choose your example. You could donate to the NRA. You could donate to Planned Parenthood. You could set it up. You set it up so that these donations are aversive. You set it up so that your future self would be mortified at this. Mm-hmm. And so you do. And the idea of this self-binding is you treat your future self as if he or she is your enemy. Mm-hmm. As if he or she is another person who is battling you. Mm-hmm. And so you set up punishments and rewards against this other person. And this got me interested more generally into the idea of multiple selves. So that was one route into the article. A second route in the article is something which I know you've done a lot of work on, which is the happiness research. And I've always been puzzled by certain contradictions from this research, such as the sort of notorious finding that children make you unhappy, that having children makes you unhappy, but people think it makes you happy. Yeah. Or Danny Kahneman's wonderful work on how we remember painful experiences, finding that that if you have a really painful experience that lasts for a while, like an unpleasant dental procedure, you'll remember it better if you add a little bit of extra pain at the end. And because you tend to remember things based on how they ended. So at the time you're in a procedure, if the dentist says, "We're done now, do you want some extra pain?" You say, "Of course not. This is ridiculous. I want to go home." But later on, you would have been better off if you asked for the extra pain. With regard to kids, you ask somebody, "What's the greatest joy in your life?" And if they've had kids, a very common answer is, "My kids. My life has been transformed by having kids." But if you test people by sort of beeping them or getting them to fill out a diary while they're with their kids, then the kids tend to be a pain in the ass, and they'd be happier without them. So it's these tensions I tried to struggle with in the article. And one way to deal with them, the self-binding and the happiness stuff, is with the idea that a person is a community of different selves, and these selves can be at war with one another. In the self-binding case, they could have different opinions about events. They could look at things in different ways, and that's what got me interested in the topic.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite topics, so I'm going to have to resist saying too much about it. I mean, I think it's important. One of the important things to distinguish then is that there's that you could think about multiplicity of selves. You can think about the community of selves at a time and a community of selves over time, and you can end up with lots of coordination problems. And this is the way I tend to think of it. And it comes out of the work of Thomas Schelling and Jan Elster, who you both mentioned, who think of weakness of will problems as intrapersonal coordination problems. So they're like formally the same as the collective action problems that we all recognize. We want to keep the park clean, but my littering, contributes almost nothing to whether the park is clean or not. But if everybody litters, then the park is going to be filthy. We need some way of solving this problem so that everybody follows a norm that keeps the park clean. The provision of all sorts of public goods in society depends on solving these collective action problems. And I found it just profoundly insightful, the idea that the achievement of your individual goals requires the solution of a collective action problem, where the participants in the collective action problem are different phases of yourself over time. And so that's in a lot of the self-binding stuff that you talk about comes out of that. I find that fascinating. But there's also the problem that you also mentioned, that a lot of social psychologists show very clearly that how we behave is very context sensitive. And a lot of people will even say this like in an explicit way, like, I'm a different person when I'm with grandma than when I'm with my best friend Booger. That there's these different personas. And at some sense these personas coexist, and there are all sorts of situations where you kind of have to decide which persona to boot up in order to decide what you're going to do next. And a lot of times the goals of these various personas, what you need to maximize your reputation with grandma, is the opposite of what you need to maximize your reputation with Booger, who wants you to do the keg stand. And so that's a sort of different collective action problem when you're trying to figure out what your plurality of personas, what the best decision, if we're like a democracy of personas, and each moment there's sort of needs to be a vote to decide what would maximize the social welfare function of all these personas. That's also a fascinating problem for which there can be no answer.
Yeah, it's social psychologists would look at it the way you're describing, sort of with maybe differing in one way, which is the selves that pop out in different situations. There's nobody mandating that the Booger self versus the grandma self pops up. They just emerge, triggered by different contexts. I have a colleague, John Barge, who does some amazing research showing that people's behavior can be primed through all sorts of unconscious cues. So if you give somebody a warm cup of coffee to hold as opposed to some iced coffee, and later on ask them to rate the personality of the person they were dealing with, they're more likely to rate the person as a warm person if they got the warm coffee and a cold person who got the cold coffee. You give them words to unscramble, and the words include words like Florida and grandma, and then they'll leave the lab and they'll walk slower. So you have all these personality things triggered by the situation. But at the same time, there's the problem that you, I think, rightfully describe as unsolvable, which is if you have a community of selves, how do you make decisions? And what I try to do at the end of the article is I'm very sympathetic to the traditional view, which is that some of the selves are responsible, and they want to go visit grandma and work on your book and love the family and give to charity, and other ones want to smoke pot with Booger and watch porn and take drugs and beat up people. And the responsible self should win. The responsible self should override the more reflexive selves. But what I try to argue is it's not always so simple. Sometimes responsible, deliberative selves can actually be monstrous. A lot of terrible acts are committed by people who consciously, carefully thought about them and deeply thought ideologies. While if they listen to their more reflexive self, they'd say, hey, throwing a bomb into a daycare center is really awful. Don't do that. Or people have these weird obsessions, and if they listen to their gut, they would be better people. So it shouldn't quite be a democracy with each self having equal say, but it's not as simple as giving the deliberative selves absolute power. That's
so fascinating. It's so true. I mean, so especially if you have as I do, a sentimentalist view about morality, that people's moral conduct is governed by norms that they've internalized, that what you're counting on is that people's sort of sympathetic moral responses are going to guide them in the right kind of way. And people aren't really deeply responsible for the norm that they've internalized. You just do internalize it. That's why the moral culture is so important. But you want people to be responsive to that, right? Like, so if you might realize that if you're working in a corporation and that you have the sense that what you're about to do is wrong, but God damn it, if you did it, you're going to get a huge bonus this year, and so your deliberative self overrides your moral conception. That's definitely one of those cases where the prudential self with a longer term view of your interests is the one you don't want to be decisive. But you do want that self to be decisive when it comes to, should I eat this entire ice cream cake? And that's why, and you mentioned this in your paper, in your article, why a lot of the kind of sort of new paternalist initiatives that try to help people control themselves by putting taxes on cigarettes or whatnot, all these things that are supposed to help, they always bias things in terms of the long-term self. And some people need a weekend in Vegas. Sometimes you need to blow a bunch of money for no good reason. Sometimes you need to get trashed. That's sometimes the right thing to do.
All right, man.
Yeah.
No, you're right. You're right.
Yeah, and sometimes Booger is right. I mean, like, sometimes Booger's like, hey, man, like, you are a bundle of nerves, and we need to smoke you up, man, and you need to, like, settle down, and, maybe we can go out and get some tail, and you're going to feel better, right? Sometimes Booger's right. But then the question is then, like, because it's not clear who's in control. You have that great Fodor quote in there, like, if there's all these different selves, somebody better be in control, and it, damn well better be me.
By God, it better be me.
Got it. But if you can't decide who me is, then the question about which persona to give the reins to at any time is completely vexing. And part of me wants to retreat to something like an old-fashioned Aristotelian virtue view, where this is really about people just have to develop judgment. And there's no substitute. There's no rule. There's no algorithm. You just have to have judgment about whether to go along with Booger or not. And there's not really a determinative answer about whether or not it's the best thing to do to eat the cake right now. And so one of the things that I don't like about laws that attempt to bias people's behavior in favor of their long-term selves is that it is short-circuiting the judgment that people need to exercise in order to live well. But at the same time, you don't want people to make mistakes that are preventable. So, yeah, I find it a complete thicket.
I agree, and the new paternalism, libertarian paternalism by Thaler and Sunstein, I have a lot of sympathy for. I just, in part because they make the very nice point that governments and businesses are often in a position of providing options, and these options have to be weighed some way or another. So why not weigh them in things that you would, in a manner that you think would be for people's best interest? But at the same time, I appreciate your point, which is often people need to be left alone to choose what's in their own interest, and often your decisions about what's in people's best interest is going to be in your own best interest. Parenting is a good example of this. I wouldn't want my kids to hang out with Booger, your friend Booger, and chase tail and smoke pot. I want them to study and be good and do all the things that parents want their kids to do. Because my interests aren't quite the same as theirs.
Right.
If they have a great time with Booger, I don't get any of the benefits of their great time. On the other hand, if they do well in school and become successful, I get a lot of pride and benefits. So our priorities differ a little bit. But I think if anybody has a right to be paternalistic, it's a parent.
It seems to follow. Yeah.
But your discussion of how we should weigh priorities and moral sentiments provides a nice segue to something I was going to ask you about, because I know you have a project looking at the sort of very broad question about the best way in which we should live our lives.
Yeah, well, I'll talk about it a little bit. I'd rather talk about about your book.
Okay.
But I'm working on a book project that is people who've been watching Free Will will have noticed that I've been talking to a lot of people who do work in moral psychology, like Josh Knobe and Jesse Prinz and Sean Nichols and others like that, John Haidt. And one of the reasons is that I have this project where I've been trying to synthesize some of the recent work in moral psychology to provide to distill, the descriptive part of the project is to distill down our best recent account of what the human moral capacity comes to. And I think that is a sort of quasi or a neo-sentimentalist account that Smith and Hume are a lot closer to being right about morality than, say, Kant. One of the things that I'm just that distillation I don't think is that interesting a book, even though it's interesting in itself. One of the things that I find most fascinating, drawing on the work of John Haidt, is that there do seem to be different dimensions to the human moral sensibility, some of which you can identify as more or less conservative, some of which you can identify as more or less liberal. And it strikes me as quite clear that we are becoming, by we, I basically mean, well, I actually mean most of the world, that the world is becoming more liberal over time, that the moral culture, specifically in the West, in the U.S. and Europe and places like that, that we're actually rapidly becoming more morally liberal when you think about the kinds of moral sentiments that we tend to regard as decisive and the kinds of justificatory strategies that we tend to think of as decisive. So there's a puzzle about why we are becoming more liberal. So part of what I'm working on is an explanation of why we've become more liberal. And as people know that I'm a market fundamentalist, as some people like to say, I say it's the growth of basically globalization, the growth of capitalism has made us more liberal. That will be controversial. But Contra Haidt, who I understand is working on a book that explains why we need a balance of our conservative and liberal sentiments, I want to argue that we've become much more liberal. That has had enormous beneficial consequences for human beings in terms of health, wealth, happiness, the development of capacities, and basically any good thing that you can think of. And I think the evidence just points in the direction that we ought to become even more liberal as a culture, like that our moral culture ought to become more liberal, and that we would become even wealthier and healthier, and our capacities would be developed further. So I'm actually make an argument for the continued suppression of the conservative elements of the moral sensibility, and actually try to argue to moral and political conservatives that they stand in the way of enormous moral progress by trying to, stand athwart history and yell stop.
That sounds fascinating. I'm very sympathetic, at least to one aspect of that argument, which concerns the moral intuitions revolving around purity and issues of disgust and repugnance in the domains of sex and other things. Of sex and food and so on, which is, I think that those intuitions almost always lead us astray. I think those intuitions underlie the obsessive concerns with female chastity and the gruesome violence that grows out from it. They underlie a lot of the anti-gay sentiment that people have.
Yes.
And I think we'd be so much better off without any moral systems having to do with purity, and a lot of our more consequentialist morality will then step in and help us not do certain things that otherwise we felt were wrong because of purity concerns, and they're actually wrong due to other concerns. But what I was going to ask you, so what would be an example of something of a sort of conservative moral system we now have in the United States that you would argue we should do away with and replace with a liberal one?
There are a number of things that you just mentioned, right? So conservative ideas about the structure of the family it has played a huge role in American politics, right? So the idea that if we created formal equality for gays when it came to the rights of marriage, there's been arguments that would just completely destabilize our society. That strikes me as false. That there's no evidence for that society won't be destabilized if gays are allowed to marry, and that the moral impulses that underlie these arguments are, like you say, like these disgust impulses. And so some people are having their equal rights denied to them because some people have these moral sentiments that I argue basically serve no important purpose whatsoever. I also think that there's a very strong bias in favor of family in general, and this is, I think, quite controversial. And so, if talking, going back to the stuff about how kids don't make you as happy as you might think they might, I think like our public policy is incredibly weighted in favor of family formation, in favor of rooted home ownership, in ways that I think are based in conservative moral sentiments that I think actually can harm a lot of people in the long run. That there's not that we don't really need to be inducing people to have more children by giving them tax credits. We don't need to be inducing people to buy homes rather than rent them by giving them huge mortgage deductions. So I'm basically telling you why, besides being an atheist, why I would never win an election in the United States. But I would argue...
You couldn't get elected dog catcher.
Yeah, I couldn't get elected dog catcher.
On the anti-family platform you're proposing, where you basically try to usurp all of the traditional values that people hold dear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm saying that hearth and home and religious community and a sense of religious transcendence are things that are standing in the way of further liberalization.
That's quite the slogan.
Yep, against hearth, home, and the church.
Yes.
And I will claim, people like Voltaire as. But the interesting thing is that I think there's actually evidence for a lot of these things, and I want to say that I don't just try to give it to conservatives. Then the latter half of the polemical part of the book is addressed towards liberals, and says that they're not liberal enough, and that they need to. That basically contemporary liberalism is in an adolescent stage. That if our moral sensibilities have become more liberal over time and could become yet more liberal, where we've gotten to now is, I think, like 15 years old in terms of the maturity of our liberalism. And the things that I think are really standing in the way is the notion of the egalitarian nation state, which creates a big in-group necessarily requires a big in-group out-group distinction between citizens and non-citizens. And that, in turn, creates a huge impediment to what I think is the biggest potential source of humanitarian gains out there, which is the liberalization of immigration all over the world. And I wouldn't just call it the liberalization of immigration. I would refer to it as doing a better job of respecting people's fundamental human right to mobility. And that respecting mobility rights, and I think the evidence here is just overwhelming, and I just don't think a lot of people are aware of it yet, that even small increases in the ability of people from poorer countries to move across borders would create massive gains in human welfare. And that one of the things standing in the way is the idea of the redistributivist liberal welfare state, which creates a strong sense, it needs a strong sense of national solidarity. So, and then the other part addressed to the left is a warning about drifting into conservative sentiment. So I think that there is something that I call the conservative left, which is largely the environmental left, that is obsessed with purity when it comes to food, when it comes to their attitude towards the planet. I think that there's an important empirical debate to be had about global warming and the quality of the environment. But I sense in lots of these, the local food movement and the way that all hooks into the environmental movement, there's a very strongly what I think of as conservative, localist, hunker down, anti-growth, sort of like home and hearth kind of leftism that I think is a danger for a lot of American liberals, so I advise them against it.
There's a point that was made by Pinker and by Appia in different ways with regard to liberals versus conservatives. The way Haidt sees it, and he has a lot of support for it, is that conservatives are more concerned about purity in general than liberals. But Pinker and Appia point out that it might just be a difference in domain. So when it comes to sex and sexual behavior, conservatives are obsessed with issues of abstinence and purity and fidelity. But when it comes to food, liberals might be more concerned with purity, with concerns about where the food came from, concerns about genetically modified foods, and the idea of things being natural and untainted might actually connect more to a purity part of the mind than a consequential part of the mind. And it's complicated because I think a lot of arguments about food can be made in very consequential terms, like Peter Singer's arguments about, it's a bad thing to torture animals to death so we could eat them. And you don't have to have a purity module to look at this. But I think you're right, which is a lot of movements that identify themselves as liberals are concerned with purity and also issues of in-group and out-group. The in-group and out-group is a truly uphill battle for somebody like you because it is such a fundamental part of human nature that I'm going to value my family more than I'm going to value your family and my tribe more than your tribe. But I think as a society and as a world, we should do as much as we can, at least not to exaggerate our in-group biases, to sort of dissolve them a little bit, make us a little bit more generous to those who don't share our genes and don't share our immediate environment.
Well, Paul, like one of the things that has been most shocking to me in terms of my own, the evolution of my own ideas, is the extent to which thinking about in-groups and out-groups has made me come to conclusions that are really at odds with a lot of my libertarian friends. So one of the things that I've decided is that the emergence of the modern nation state has been a huge humanitarian boon, which I have some fairly deep-seated anti-statist impulses. But looking through history on net, the creation of national communities did a lot, and national identities, I think did a lot to level the playing field for a lot of people. That by wiping out these more local identities or making more local identities less salient to people, it created the possibility of much broader scale cooperation, and that's been good for people. And so my sense is that then we just need to go farther. And I think one of the best things that's happened in the last 20 years is the creation of the common labor market within the EU. I think that's one of the biggest signs of moral progress that the world's seen, and it's been largely unheralded. But the ability of people to move across these borders and to find work in all these different labor markets has had a huge impact on people's economic and material well-being. And I argue for the same thing in terms of the U.S. I would like to see NAFTA become a common labor market in North America, not unlike the EU has been. And that's not popular with a lot of people who have politics that are similar to mine, but I find it pretty compelling. But I think the fact that we've gone up to the point, there's nothing natural about the nation state as the in-group, right? To get that big and that abstract is already a pretty big achievement in pushing out the circle of moral concern. And I think the Europeans have been taking the lead on pushing it past the national boundary and creating a European identity, and I think that's to be encouraged. And I encourage a North American identity. If there's a fellow I know who's been fighting to change Canadian citizenship laws, and if he succeeds, I'm going to try to become a Canadian citizen, partly because I would like to... my father was Canadian, but I'm not eligible under the current regime. Partly because I like the idea of having a broader North American identity rather than just an American identity, and I'd like to promote that kind of ethos. But anyway, I wandered way off, and I said I didn't want to talk about my project, and then I wasted most of our time talking about it.
Well, all I'll add is that I myself am Canadian, and it's just terrific.
It's terrific.
I'm a dual citizen.
You're a dual citizen? Yeah, it's great, and you can, so you've got 2 passports?
I had 2 passports. A bit of advice: never show 2 passports to a customs officer.
Yeah.
I did that when I was 14. I thought it was funny, and I just asked them to choose, and it wasn't funny at all. and so I actually let my Canadian one expire, so I travel under an American passport.
Yeah. Well,
but if I ever need some free health care, I know where to go.
That's right. I wanted to ask you about your book, but I wasted most of our time. So let's say we could take about 5 minutes on it. So you're working on a project about, you call it an essentialist theory of pleasure. And tell me what you mean by that.
I'm interested in the idea. There's an idea in philosophy and psychology that people are essentialists. That when we see the world, we make sense of the world. We don't respond to the superficial aspects of things, but rather we respond to what we see as their deeper natures, their history, their microstructure. And what I try to do in my book, which is about pleasure, is argue that this could explain a lot of puzzles and a lot of interesting things about what we like about sex and food and art and everyday objects, and arguing that in all of these cases we respond not to the superficial aspects of things but to their deeper natures. So even young children, for instance, will distinguish an original from a duplicate. And if the original is something precious to them, like a teddy bear, they will prefer the original, not because it looks or smells different, but because it has a different history. An original artwork is worth extremely more than a perfect duplicate, even if you can't tell the difference, again, because of its history. And for sex and food, for instance, we are sort of very sensitive to what we believe it is. A wine will taste different if you think it's an expensive wine versus a cheap wine. Meat will taste different if you think it's chicken versus pork versus human flesh. And in the sexual domain, it's the most sort of it's the most immediately compelling domain. What we get aroused by and are disgusted by doesn't necessarily have much to do with doesn't only have to do with the superficial appearance of the person, but who we think the person is, what we think the person is. When a common theme, for instance, in Shakespeare, and then also in the Old Testament, and all over the place, was what Wendy Doniger describes as the bed trick. And the bed trick is when you go to bed with somebody who you think is one sex, but is actually the other. And typically, you think it's a woman, but it turns out to be a man. And more generally, the bed trick is there's just confusion about who you're dealing with, and it matters immensely. It matters. Nobody says
it doesn't matter how good the sex was, right? Yeah, that could have been the best mind-blowing sex you had in your life, and so that experience is already had, right? And then later you find out it's like the crying game, and then somehow that ruins it.
Right, and I guess we're giving away the ending, but everyone knows this. So there's giving away the twist, but the crying game, Fergus, I think it is, has sex with somebody who he believes to be a woman, discovers that this person has a penis, and is revolted. He throws up. He just is terrible, and nobody. And this is a natural way to respond. Very few people say, "Oh, what's the difference? I enjoyed it. Doesn't matter."
Yeah. And so you say that was the most delicious meal I ever had, and somebody said, yes, and you just ate your grandmother. And then you're like, ugh! Right, it doesn't matter that it wasn't
You don't go
delicious.
for seconds.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a good example. I mean, another example is...
I don't think my grandma would taste that good, by the way. No, nothing against you, Grandma. Yeah.
Is she watching this?
No, she doesn't know how to... She doesn't have a computer, no.
Okay. I mean, another example from sex is I have heard that there are these celebrity sites where you see clips of naked celebrities. And what's interesting about this is you could see a clip and you're told this is the thigh of this gorgeous actress, and you can say, wow, it's very arousing. But of course, it could be anybody's thigh. It could be male. It could be somebody else. And my point is, it just matters immensely. Who we think it is.
Yeah. So if it's Jennifer Aniston's thigh, that's a lot hotter than the thigh of... Well, there's the website Mr. Skin. For some reason, I know about this. I don't know. It
was mentioned in a movie.
Yeah, maybe
Knocked Up.
Knocked Up. Yeah, that's how I know about it. Of course.
That's how you know.
Yeah, because I've never. I don't actually use the internet myself for any purposes other than email reading and research. But yeah, like you could pay a subscription to Mr. Skin, and it shows you all the scenes where famous actresses are naked, and they don't look any different than all of the other women on the internet. The millions, I think about half the people on Earth are naked on the internet, and so you've got a pretty wide selection of the best. But it just matters more if it's somebody who's famous for some reason, which is weird.
Yes, and you can imagine you do a sort of more simple experiment in your own life. Take your partner. Everybody could imagine their partner, and somebody who you've known for a long time, and you've seen naked a lot. Now imagine looking at his or her identical twin naked, and my bet is that it's a different experience. That, say, you might find it very arousing, even though it's to all intents and purposes the same body, because we're not necessarily aroused by bodies per se. We're aroused by who we think those bodies belong to.
That's fascinating. As far as I know, Carrie doesn't have a twin, so I'm not a subject. But any of you out there
who are
married to somebody with an identical twin, Professor Bloom has an experiment that he would like your assistance with.
It's a good place to end, I guess.
Well, Paul, it was a pleasure. I hope we can do it again. Thanks so much for coming on, and we'll have links to your articles in Slate, Does Religion Make You Nice, and your Atlantic piece, First Person Plural, over in the sidebar. Have a great Sunday.
Thank you so much for having me on this. Have a great Sunday yourself.
All right. Take care.
Bye.